When you put God above everything else, your life will change. Now, I know you've heard that before, right? It sounds simple enough. Put God first and everything else will fall into place. But let me ask you, really ask yourself, have you ever truly lived out what that means? Because if you did, it would change everything. I'm talking about not just putting God in your life, but putting God above everything in your life. Above your plans, above your comfort, above your dreams, and even above your relationships. Because when God is at the top, everything below it starts to shift. Your perspective changes. Your decisions change. Your peace changes. Your joy changes. And let me tell you, that's where the transformation begins. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to put something else above God. It's subtle at first, but over time it creeps in. Your job becomes your focus. Your relationships become your identity. Your dreams become your priority. And God, well, he becomes one part of your life, just one of many pieces in the puzzle. But the problem with that is that God wasn't meant to be a piece of the puzzle. He was meant to be the puzzle itself. He's not meant to be one area you visit on Sundays. He's meant to be the foundation of everything you do. So let me ask you again, what happens when you put God above everything else? It's going to feel like a challenge at first. Why? Because we're taught to chase after everything else. We're taught to chase success. We're taught to chase relationships. We're taught to chase happiness. But when you put God above all those things, everything changes. You no longer live to chase, you live to seek first his kingdom. And when you do that, everything else falls into its rightful place. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a life where every decision, every step, every moment is guided by the simple but profound truth that God is above all things. Your day isn't dictated by what's trending or what's popular, but by what God says is important. Your priorities shift. What once seemed urgent is now viewed through the lens of eternity. And when you put God at the top, you start to see that all the things you've been chasing after, the promotion, the approval, the status, are nothing compared to the peace that comes from walking in alignment with God's will. It's easy to say God first when everything is going well. It's easy to put God above everything when the path is clear and the sky is blue. But what happens when the storms roll in? What happens when life gets hard, when the job isn't fulfilling, when the relationship starts falling apart, when the dreams you've worked for start to crumble? That's when your true priorities are revealed. Will you still put God above everything else when things aren't going the way you expected? Will you still trust him when everything else seems to be falling apart? This is where the rubber meets the road, because when you put God above everything, you stop living for what's temporary and start living for what's eternal. You stop living for the quick fix and you start living for the long-term fulfillment. You stop living for the applause of the crowd and you start living for the approval of the one who created you. And here's the key. When God is truly first in your life, even the storms don't shake you. You're grounded in him. Your identity is rooted in him. Your confidence is anchored in him. And when the winds blow and the waves crash, you stand firm because you know that your life isn't built on the shifting sands of circumstances. It's built on the solid rock of Christ. When you put God above everything, your life starts to shift in ways you can't even imagine. You start to experience a peace that surpasses all understanding, a joy that doesn't depend on your circumstances, and a purpose that gives your life meaning beyond what this world can offer. It's like stepping into a whole new realm of living where you're not bound by what you see with your natural eyes, but you're led by the truth of God's word. Your life becomes an overflow of his love, and people start to notice, not because you're perfect, but because there's something different about you. There's a peace that radiates from you, a hope that doesn't make sense in a world filled with chaos. And that's what happens when you put God above everything else. Your life becomes a testimony of his goodness. But let's be real for a moment. The temptation to put other things above God is always going to be there. It's not easy. We're constantly bombarded with messages that say you need more, you deserve more, you're not enough unless you have this or that. But here's the truth. You are enough because God says you are. You don't need anything more than his presence to be complete. And when you truly understand that, it shifts your entire perspective. Suddenly, you don't need the approval of others to feel validated. You don't need the approval of the world to feel worthy. You have all you need in Christ. And when that becomes the foundation of your life, everything changes. What if I told you that the breakthrough you've been praying for, the shift you've been waiting for, could happen simply by putting God above everything else? What if the key to everything you've been asking for isn't about striving or working harder, but simply realigning your priorities? Imagine what would happen if in every decision you asked yourself, is this bringing me closer to God, or is it pulling me away from him? What if you stopped chasing after the things the world says you need and started pursuing the one who holds everything in his hands? Putting God above everything isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily commitment. Every day you wake up and choose to put God first. You choose to seek him before you seek success. You choose to honor him before you honor your desires. And when you make that choice day after day, it becomes a lifestyle. It becomes who you are. And your life, your heart, your mind, your spirit begins to reflect him in every way. I know you might be asking yourself, how do I put God above everything? It starts with surrender. It starts with giving God the first of your time. It starts with making his word the foundation of your decisions. It starts with trusting him even when the road ahead seems uncertain. It starts with understanding that you are his child and his plan for you is far better than anything you could plan for yourself. When you start putting God above everything, you start to see the fruit of his spirit in your life: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These aren't just nice ideas. They're the markers of a life that's been transformed by God's presence. And let me tell you, when the world sees a life marked by these things, they can't help but take notice. You become a light in the darkness. You become a reflection of his grace, his mercy, and his power. And that's the kind of life that makes a difference. So let me ask you again, what would your life look like if you truly put God above everything else? If you allowed him to be the foundation of your decisions, the center of your heart, the focus of your energy, I promise you, it would look radically different. It would be filled with peace that doesn't make sense, joy that's unshakable, and a purpose that's unmovable. Because when God is at the top, everything else falls into place. When you choose to put God above everything else, you begin to unlock a new level of freedom in your life. Freedom from the pressure to perform, freedom from the need for constant approval, and freedom from living in fear of what others think. You no longer feel chained to the world's expectations or its fleeting standards. The truth is, when you make God your first priority, you're not just aligning your life with his will, you're stepping into a life of purpose and significance that's rooted in his eternal love for you. And here's the thing, when God is above everything else, it doesn't just impact your relationship with him, it impacts every other relationship in your life. Think about it. When you put God first, you begin to love others with a love that's not based on their actions or behaviors, but on the love that God has shown you. You begin to offer grace, forgiveness, and kindness, even when it's difficult, because you realize that God has given you more grace than you could ever give. You begin to serve others with a selflessness that reflects the heart of Christ. And the more you focus on putting God above everything else, the more you become the person God created you to be. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that putting God first means you have to give up everything you love or everything you've worked for. But that's not the case. When you put God above everything, it doesn't mean you have to abandon your dreams, your career, or your relationships. It means that you begin to align them with God's will. You start to see them through the lens of his purpose for your life, and you allow him to lead you in how to use them for his glory. Your passions, your goals, your ambitions, they all become opportunities to honor God and serve his kingdom. You begin to see everything you have as a gift from God. and you're filled with gratitude for his provision and guidance, suddenly your life isn't about you anymore. It's about using everything you have to make an eternal impact. But this isn't always easy. In a world that constantly pulls you in different directions, it can be difficult to keep God at the center. There are times when the demands of life, whether it's work, family, or personal struggles, try to take priority. And in those moments, it's tempting to shift your focus and rely on your own strength, thinking you can handle it on your own. But that's when you need to remember that God is not just a part of your life, he is your life. You can't live without him. You can't face the challenges of this world without his wisdom, his peace, and his strength. And when you put God above everything, you learn to depend on him in ways that you never thought possible. You learn to lean on his understanding rather than your own, and you begin to see solutions where there seem to be none. You realize that the strength you've been searching for doesn't come from your own efforts. It comes from God, and it's available to you every single day. You start to walk in his power, not your own. You speak with his authority, not your own. And when you do that, nothing can stand in your way. It's in these moments of complete surrender, when you put God first, that you begin to see the supernatural work in your life. You begin to see things shift in ways that go beyond your natural ability. God starts to open doors that you never thought possible. He starts to make a way where there seems to be no way. You may not see it at first, but when you align your life with his will, he starts working behind the scenes, orchestrating things for your good and his glory. But let me be clear, putting God first doesn't mean life will be perfect. It doesn't mean you won't face struggles or challenges. In fact, you may face even more opposition, because when you make the decision to put God at the center of your life, the enemy takes notice. He doesn't want you to walk in the fullness of God's purpose. He doesn't want you to experience the peace and joy that comes from living in God's will. But here's the thing, when you put God above everything else, you have the authority to stand firm in your faith. You have the power to resist the enemy's lies. And even when you face hardships, you can walk in confidence, knowing that God is with you, that he's for you, and that he's already overcome the world. The beauty of putting God first is that you begin to experience a level of intimacy with him that surpasses anything you've known before. It's not about religion or routine, it's about relationship. When you put God above everything else, you start to hear his voice more clearly. You start to feel his presence more deeply. You begin to understand his heart and his desires for your life in a way that transforms you from the inside out. And the more you seek him, the more you discover that everything you need is already found in him. In moments of uncertainty, when you don't know which direction to go, when the road ahead seems unclear, it's in those moments that God's voice becomes the loudest. He leads you, he guides you, and he gives you the courage to move forward. When God is above everything else, you're no longer making decisions based on fear or insecurity. You're making decisions based on trust in his faithfulness and provision. And that's when true peace takes over. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, the kind of peace that can only come from knowing that you're walking in God's will. There are times when you may doubt if putting God above everything is truly worth it. You may question if it's really making a difference. But let me tell you, every step you take toward putting God first is a step toward transformation. Every prayer, every act of obedience, every moment spent in his presence is building something eternal. And even when you don't see the results right away, know that God is working in ways you can't see. His word says that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. So even when the process feels slow, even when the breakthrough feels distant, trust that God is doing something powerful in your life. And when you reach those moments of doubt or struggle, remember that God is not asking you to figure it all out on your own. He's not asking you to have all the answers. He's asking you to trust him with your whole heart, to lean not on your own understanding, but to acknowledge him in all your ways. And when you do that, he promises to direct your paths. He promises to guide you. He promises that his presence will never leave you and his love will never fail you. So My encouragement to you today is simple. Put God above everything else. Make him the first priority in your life, and watch as he begins to transform everything around you. Watch as he makes a way where there seems to be no way. Watch as he opens doors, brings healing, and fills your heart with peace. When you put God first, your life will change. It won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it. Trust in him with everything you are, and you'll see the incredible ways he will move in your life. God is waiting for you to put him above everything else, and when you do, you'll experience a life beyond what you ever imagined. When you put God above everything else, it becomes more than just a decision or a momentary choice. It becomes the foundation of your life, a deep conviction that you carry in every circumstance. It's like a lens through which you view the world, a lens that sharpens your focus on God's will and purpose for your life. And this is where the transformation happens. When God becomes the lens through which you see everything, it shifts your entire perspective. The things that once seemed important, the things you thought you couldn't live without, suddenly lose their grip on you. You begin to realize that everything you've been striving for is nothing compared to the treasure of knowing Christ. And when you let go of the things that used to occupy your heart, God fills that space with something far greater: his love, his peace, his presence. But let's be honest for a moment. We're all human, right? And as much as we want to put God first, there are times when other things try to take precedence. We all face distractions, challenges, and desires that threaten to pull us away from our ultimate purpose of keeping God at the center of our lives. The world constantly tells us that we need more success, more possessions, more recognition, and the enemy whispers lies that we need to prove ourselves, that we need to secure our own future, that we need to take control of our own destiny. But that's where we need to remind ourselves of the truth. Our future is in God's hands. Our destiny is secure in him. We don't need to chase after the things of this world when we have the creator of the universe on our side. When God is above everything else, there is a peace that comes from knowing that you don't have to strive for what God has already promised. There's a peace in trusting that he will provide for you in every season, even when things don't look the way you imagined. You see, we tend to place our faith in what we can see, what we can touch, and what we can control. But God calls us to a faith that's not based on what's visible, but on his character, on his promises, and on the truth that he is always faithful to complete the work he has started in us. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about trusting that God has already figured it out for us. And the more you learn to trust him, the more you experience his faithfulness, and the more you see how his plans for your life far exceed anything you could have imagined on your own. There's something powerful about choosing to put God first every day. It's a daily decision that requires surrender, surrendering your plans, your desires, your ambitions, and your fears to him. And when you do that, you begin to experience the peace that comes with knowing you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. God is. The pressure to perform, to achieve, to measure up, all of that fades when you realize that God is in control. And when you stop carrying the burden of trying to be everything for everyone, you begin to see that God has already provided all that you need in him. His grace is sufficient, his strength is enough, and his presence is the only thing that truly satisfies. When you put God above everything else, you also begin to see that your life is not just about you. It's about serving others, loving others, and being a reflection of God's heart in the world. You begin to understand that your purpose isn't just to live for yourself, but to be a vessel of his love, his grace, and his power. You're no longer focused on what you can get, but on what you can give. You begin to see others through the eyes of compassion, and you start to make decisions based on how you can help encourage and uplift those around you. And when you live with this kind of mindset, you realize that your life has greater meaning than just what you can accumulate for yourself. Your life becomes about something bigger than you, something eternal. This doesn't mean that you'll never face challenges or moments of doubt. It doesn't mean that everything will be perfect or that you'll always have it all together. But what it does mean is that when you face those challenges, you'll have a foundation that can't be shaken. When God is above everything else, you're not swayed by the ups and downs of life. You're not tossed around by the storms or the setbacks. You stand firm in the truth that God is with you, that He's for you, and that His plans for your life are good. You learn to navigate the challenges with the peace that comes from knowing you're not alone in the fight. God goes before you, He walks beside you, and He holds you up when you can't stand on your own. And let me tell you, this kind of life, this life of putting God above everything else, is contagious. People begin to notice something different about you. They see a peace that doesn't make sense, a joy that doesn't depend on circumstances, and a confidence that isn't rooted in what the world has to offer. When you put God first, you become a living testimony of His goodness and His grace. You don't have to preach at people or force them to believe. Your life becomes the message. People are drawn to the light that shines from within you, and they begin to wonder why you're different, why you're so calm in the midst of the storm, why you can face hardship with hope. And when they ask, that's your opportunity to point them to the one who is the source of it all. But it all starts with you. It all starts with the decision to put God above everything else. It's a decision that you make every day and every moment. It's a decision to surrender your will to His, to trust His timing, and to seek His kingdom above all else. And when you do that, everything changes. Your heart changes, your mind changes, your actions change, and your life becomes a testimony of God's transforming power. You begin to experience the life that Jesus promised, the life that is abundant, full of peace, full of purpose, and full of His presence. So I want to encourage you today, don't settle for a life that's just about getting by, just about surviving. Don't settle for a life where God is just a part of the equation, something you add when you need it. Put God above everything else. Let Him be the center of your life, and watch as He transforms you, your relationships, and your circumstances in ways you never thought possible. Watch as He opens doors you couldn't open on your own, as He provides in ways that only He can, and as He fills your heart with a peace and joy that nothing in this world can take away. When you put God above everything else, your life will change, and that change will be for the better, not just for today, but for eternity. In conclusion, when you choose to put God above everything else, you are making the most important decision of your life. It's not just about prioritizing Him above your plans, your desires, or the distractions of this world. It's about fully surrendering to His will and trusting that His plan for your life is greater than anything you could ever imagine. In doing so, you will find peace that surpasses all understanding, strength that rises above your weaknesses, and a joy that doesn't depend on circumstances. Your life will begin to change, not because of what you do, but because of who you allow to lead you. When you place God at the center, everything else falls into its rightful place. You will experience the freedom of trusting His guidance, the power of His presence, and the assurance that no matter what comes your way, God is with you, for you, and working through you. So keep Him above everything else and watch as He transforms your life in ways you could never have imagined.